Thank you, Michael. I think we're on. Are we on? Okay. Now, thank you all very much for coming today. It's certainly my time here at RSIS has been fantastic. I've been here for about 10 days so far, and folks asked me to come down based on some previous interaction with the group here. We're talking about a variety of subjects, and this certainly seemed to be a subject that I thought there might be some interest in. I'm not, other than the 28 years I spent in the agency, based on the collection side and the foreign relationship side, I am not the technical military expert here to tell you about tank system X or, air missile Y. You've got plenty of expertise here in RSIS and certainly in the region that could speak to that. I'm looking at a few folks here right now that I've just met at RSIS that can certainly do that. What I was hoping today is to really kind of give you the benefit of sort of a 20, 30,000 foot look at what is happening with the military modernization program that has been going on now for basically 20 years, and what it may mean for the region, what it may mean for beyond the region, the pluses and minuses of that program, and then to stimulate a conversation with you all on this. So I'm hoping to take certainly any questions or comments that you have as we go along here. Again, the experiences that go into my thinking in making this presentation were based on the 28 years in the agency, and also with some folks that I worked with that are put together the analytical models of where this all seems to be leading, and a bit on the business side now in China. We've apparently have some businesses that are concerned about what this means for peace and security in the region, want to keep up the data. I've certainly got a personal interest in maintaining the knowledge of what's happening on the issue. But then also, you've got a lot of concern when we come out to business areas, particularly Singapore, where people in the region are looking at this and saying, what is this going to mean for, obviously not only peace and security, but global commerce and all. So it pays to pay attention to this issue and really think it through, because it's going to be with us for quite some time. You see the picture. Actually, I love this picture. Those of you who've gone down to Tiananmen and seen the flag raising or lowering, that's good. I'm always impressed with the posture, the correctness of the standing. I wish I could. My wife always tells me to get my back straight and try to be more like these guys. We're going to talk about this, several different things here. I'm just going to go down very quickly in the list, then we'll get into each of them in a little more detail. Beijing's assessment of the threat. Basically, they have done their study for quite some time, dating back to particularly the first Iraq War. Was a seminal moment in this where certainly the military leadership, but also the civilian leadership, really looked at particularly the use of smart weapons and all, and realized, we got a gap here we're going to have to deal with. And obviously this is in the post-Tiananmen period. We better get our act together. And then it was magnified later with the Taiwan Straits issue, but we'll talk a bit about that. Essentially, the conclusion on this is that it's been impressive over the last 20 years where China has gone with its modernization program, particularly on the hardware side, but it's an incomplete transformation. There are a number of areas of how to use that new capability and equipment, logistics, force training, et cetera, which we'll talk about a bit, that is still early days. And you tack on top of that the recent reorganization that Michael mentioned, and it's just adding a situation where you could really come to the conclusion of it's too early to make a definitive judgment on the success or lack thereof of this program. Particularly, I know of concern here is the maritime strategy of China. Does it have a coherent maritime strategy? Some of you, I think, were at the presentation I made last Friday at the Fullerton Hotel on the One Belt, One Road. One of the issues that came up in that is when you look at the map of the One Belt, One Road plan, particularly the maritime strategy looks eerily similar to things I saw back in government coming out of the PLA Navy, of what the PLA Navy would like to see in terms of areas of key interest, string of pearls, or whatever you may want to refer to it. And so you really can see the economic and both soft and hard power aspects of why you'd want to have a blue water navy, but it doesn't quite fit that they've actually put together or have the capabilities yet to act on that, and may not for quite some time. And we'll touch a bit on that. The bold new steps, the new reorganization. Here we'll show you a bunch of boxes of what those new organizations look like. Sort of the upfront headline on this is that while this is something that's been talked about in the Chinese leadership for quite some time about the need to basically have more jointness in its military leadership command structure, and that they need to move away from what is a continental-based, former Soviet Union, key enemy-based command structure to something capable of pursuing China's global interests. It wasn't until Xi Jinping and his ability to push that through came in to be able to make that happen. But it also has some real resistance, particularly from the Army, who's the loser in this. What do the neighbors have to say? That's where I really would like to hear comments from you all, and that clearly one of the very first touch points of the success or lack thereof or indications of intent is going to be the South China Sea, which we're watching unfold already before our eyes. It's some of this, there's no such thing as a straight line in any foreign policy. Things can get affected in terms of the reactions of others, and that's where I think the neighborhood here in Southeast Asia is going to have an outsized impact on how China reacts to its whole maritime strategy. And a new arms race, South China Sea. I mean, when you have even Indonesia talking about picking up new assets, that's part of that reaction that it's worth at least taking note of. And what does the region do in terms of, depending on how China decides to exercise its new capabilities? People are obviously going to have to look at hedging techniques, and what does that mean for the potential out there, not saying that there is, but the potential for an arms race of sorts, or certainly a like-minded military asset capability to capability reaction that could take place here. Beijing's assessment of the threat. You see the two lines there, basically the first, second island chain, more of a blue water aspect here to the naval plans. They have for many years now, again dating back to the post First Gulf War situation, and especially after the Taiwan election, the missile crisis of 95, 96, a lot of work has gone into this. And I know from those days, especially during the Taiwan crisis, I was posted in Beijing at that point the first time, and there was a lot of angst, as I'm sure there was throughout the region on this. And you had a lot of horsepower was put into it on the PLA side, and usually the best thinking that comes out, or more audacious thinking, comes out at the senior colonel level. And when somebody needs, actually the same kind of thing happens in the U.S. military, but when you get a colonel farmed out to, he's got an idea about X and it might be controversial, you get him to put something out to sort of protect the senior officers from having to come in to argue for it, but it has an effect on strategic thinking. There was a tome that came out, I believe it actually was published in 1997, but the work went into it much earlier. It was called Unrestricted Warfare, by a couple of senior colonels whose names I forget right now. But those of you, there's probably several people in here who have read that. If you haven't read it, it's worth going back and looking at even today, and I occasionally go back and look at that, because it basically was almost an item-by-item assessment of the key aspects of how the U.S. projects force, and looking at it in a very Sun Tzu kind of way of, we're not going to advocate going toe-to-toe, aircraft carrier to aircraft carrier with the U.S. We're not going to be in a position to do that for a long time. But what are the areas that we can pursue that might be weak points on the U.S. side? And certainly electronic warfare is one of those areas, dependence on satellite technology, communications, logistics challenges, and then simple geography, access area denial kind of things. And then cyber at large, in terms of both offensive capability in time of war, but also in terms of collection to help narrow that gap in terms of weapon quality and all. If you look at that book, they have followed pretty much every single one of those recommended areas since then. And this is where that clear-eyed assessment of where the U.S. is located, what do we need to do to be able to achieve our objectives without conflict and go after the weak points, the U.S. without having to spend ourselves into oblivion, which is certainly one of the lessons they learned from the Soviet Union's demise. How do we pursue that? And so they have absolutely done that. This general assessment of the pillars of U.S. power projection, again, I'll take as an example the dependence on, particularly in the Pacific, of aircraft carrier battle groups. The idea being, again, we're not going to have the ability to, at that point, obviously in the 90s, they were still thinking about buying the Ukrainian carrier, which they've only recently put in the water, let alone the ability to put together a carrier battle group and all of the logistics and everything else that go into that. But you know what? If we can make it more costly for a carrier battle group to come close into China, basically area denial, we can achieve some objectives here. And so they put a lot of effort into things like the DF-21D, assets like that would be basically an inexpensive but potentially effective way to go after these pillars of U.S. power projection. Again, the insurmountable obstacle for the PLA, despite the fact that in any good military, and Chinese included among them, you've got, I was talking to Dick, I think Dick's over here, he was mentioning about a former head of the PLA Navy commenting at one point of, before I die, I want to have an aircraft carrier. You know, that kind of mindset's in play in every kind of military about wanting, some people would call it toys for boys, having assets like that to be able to have, but then the recognition of what it takes to build up the capability to not only have them, but to use them and train for them and have the logistics in place for these kind of capabilities. It takes a heck of a lot of effort, consistent effort, and thought. And I think there have been plenty of people in the PLA who have basically come to the conclusion of it's going to be a long time off, despite consistent almost 20 years now of double-digit budget increases every year, to be in a position to have the kind of toe-to-toe capability with the U.S. We can do better and we have to do better before that time. Again, the capabilities designed to counter each pillar. I mentioned the DF-21D. Also, an area of thought here is if you think of anti-access, A2D2, area denial kind of capabilities, there's an economic component to this as well. You've got a situation where if the U.S. is dependent on bases and allies in the region to assist in the logistics and obviously some of the soft power of this, if you can get those countries to have a balance of interest here where perhaps because of economic need or concern about China's view on things, if you can get them to self-censor and not be of assistance to the U.S. in a situation like that, you have had a different way of achieving that area denial capability. And certainly if you look at something like One Belt, One Road and some of the other, the economic draw that's at play in the region, that plays into planning as well. Again, an impressive but incomplete transformation. The hardware's been great. You've got obviously things from the J-20 coming out, which looks remarkably similar to some U.S. capabilities, but that's an issue we can discuss later in terms of cyber theft. You've got what's going on with the carrier that they've outfitted and the plans to build more. Air Force has done pretty well in what they've pursued. They've done a great job on some assets related to military testing on the missile technology. We'll get into a bit on electronic warfare as well. So the capabilities across the board, I know in my time, the agency up through the time that I retired a few years ago, every year they've met or exceeded expectations in terms of the development of those weapon systems. And that was something we worked very closely with PACOM on to keep an eye on this. And that, so from the hardware side, did very well. I mentioned A2D2 electronic warfare C4ISR. the capabilities, particularly in the latter, are quite impressive. You get to a point now where it has to seriously be taken into consideration the ability, particularly on the electronic warfare side, and the knowledge of the battlefield, where it's going to be very hard in the near future for U.S. assets to hide or to be as discreet as we otherwise would like them to be in the region. China has invested quite a bit in this, and the capabilities, at least on paper, haven't been tested yet, but on paper look good. The multi-layered approach for dealing with U.S. bases and alliances, similar to what I was just saying, looking at, yeah, it's great that we are developing the hardware assets as well as the C4ISR, et cetera, but we need to work on the entities, the countries that would be supporting the U.S. strategy here, and make it more difficult when, depending on how a scenario would break out, for a risk versus gain analysis by the leadership of those countries to make the decision to actually follow through and be supportive. I think it's a much more amorphous type goal, but you see across other issues the belief that actually foreign countries and certainly the region needs that market perhaps more than they're worried about the investment into China. That's soft power, and so they're trying to work that quite aggressively. Leifeng, you got to have Leifeng. The impressive but incomplete transformation continued here, but the problem is the software side. And by the software side, I mean, I literally mean those kind of training, the how to actually use, how to inculcate in your troops the understanding of those systems and coordinate the jointness of use. We've seen there's been in PLA literature of writing on units being worried about actually using the equipment for fear of somehow damaging it, or not quite understanding how this is all going to pull together, not quite having the opportunity to test. There has not been, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but there hasn't really been an ability to test, certainly in a combat situation. So the training that has gone into this has been less rigorous than some people might want in the PLA. So it's very much still a question mark of how does all this come together, and it's going to take quite a bit of time for that to really play out in a way that I think most analysts, including many in this room, would feel comfortable in saying, you know, this capability is something that we can very much count on as being real. You've got a lot out there that shows intent in terms of the money and seemingly the commitment, but it certainly in the real world hasn't been acted upon yet, and so we'll see how that plays out. The conducting joint operations, this is obviously something that Xi Jinping and the whole reorganization that we have now recognizes. As I mentioned earlier, this has been talked about for quite some time, been very resistant in the PLA, particularly from the Army, who has enjoyed all the perks as the primary service in the military since its creation. And now you have the Navy and the Air Force being put forward in a more significant internally, bureaucratically and politically in a stronger way. And there are a number of people on the Army side who don't quite like that. Now, when the U.S. went through this process in the 80s, there was some of that as well, service rivalry that happened, and the only way you can get through that is, frankly, through consistent political pressure and commitment to this, and, frankly, time, and force the issue of that jointness to work together. It doesn't mean that China can't get there, it's just that it's very early days. The two incompatibles. This is coming out of the Chinese literature, PLA literature on this, of essentially, hey, it's great that we've got this equipment, but we haven't been able to actually train to use this yet. And we really have a situation here where we're not quite sure that the rank and file understands exactly what it means to be joint, to be able to achieve the objective of having this fully capable, modern, informatized military. And again, the doubts that have been expressed in the PLA literature about this have been pretty significant. They've been out there for a number of years now. So you could understand where some analysts might look at this and say, you know, they themselves don't necessarily believe that they're as strong as some people give them credit for being, and as advanced in the military modernization effort as some people believe they are. But it all comes back to a big question mark of it hasn't been tested yet. And that's where I think it's going to pay for a lot of scholars to really pay attention to this very closely for the coming years, to see indications of benchmarks of progress of actually being able to achieve that software ability to bring these forces together. And then finally, as I'm sure all of you know, the PLA, and certainly Xi Jinping has come out with something like 3 signed commentaries in the PLA Daily in the last several months on this issue to ensure discipline and party control. It's the party's army. It's not China's army. It's still, that aspect is seen as sacrosanct within the Communist Party of China, and certainly by Xi, but it has a way of retarding, in a sense, the capability building of the PLA and its mission, its overall mission. Clearly, that sort of feeds back to a domestic internal need rather than capability building externally. And so even though in the 18th Party Congress, and Xi comes out talking about developing, for example, a Navy that will carry out and support China's legitimate security and economic interests worldwide, at the end of the day, when you have to keep coming back about, hey, you guys do remember you're the party's army, right? You will obey orders. It sort of lends doubts, to some degree, both internally and externally, about how supportive that military really is of the party and the command and control aspects if it comes back to a domestic mindset. I think that's worth watching. Other software issues, again, it's not to beat an extremely dead horse here, but it's still very early days in actually using these assets. So again, watching training cycles and what they do in terms of international deployments, like you've seen in the Mediterranean, up in Alaska, et cetera, and how it works out. I think that aspect is worth watching more than the hardware. Coherent maritime strategy. By the way, Wu Shengli is a favorite of Xi Jinping, and this is Xi Jinping's mindset of where he wants China to be as a great power and achieve the objective of China reattaining that position. The Navy is a key aspect of this. So you can, certainly he's put into these recent party documents that China having this more assertive interest covering Navy that they say they want, and the Navy's likely to continue to be very well taken care of budget-wise. And you have to ask yourself, is this strategy, does this all hang together? Hallmarks on President Xi Jinping, he's certainly has said the right things internally and party documents, like I mentioned, and he certainly sees that in global outlook as China can't be the great power on par with the United States without a Navy that can protect those interests. Build China into a great maritime power. When that kind of language came out, actually internally that had a lot of meaning. Because, again, traditionally the Navy and the Air Force, and to some degree what was now Strategic Rocket Forces, they were the lesser child in a sense of the political power within the PLA. These guys now have claim, and certainly it fits into One Belt, One Road, other key policy priorities under Xi, of being perhaps, in many ways, the preeminent service within the PLA. Protecting the security of China's overseas interests, that's understandable in many ways, and certainly a number of countries would understood to have these interests to protect, but it's still very vague in terms of intent. And I know that's, I'm sure, one of the reasons why many of you are here wondering, what does this mean? How is China going to, what do they mean by protecting these interests? Is it something that's more benign, economic related, or is it something more? Strategic depth, they again see pushing out that line. It's very important. The Navy's going to be key for many of the things they're trying to do, not only in the South China Sea, but pushing out beyond the second island chain onto Blue Water Navy, let alone what it needs to do for missions into tied into One Belt, One Road and being able to go out into a true Blue Water Navy. The expectations for the neighbors in the U.S., that's where I want to talk with you all about and get your thoughts on this. It's going to, this aspect in particular is going to be one that is probably going to drive the neighborhood a little bit crazy, or certainly have a little bit of angst. And so the pushback is likely to come on terms of their deployment or use of the naval assets more than anything else. The reorganization here, there's no test after this, but this, and many of you probably can't see too clearly all the boxes, but essentially the old command structure has been broken up now into 3 new PLA units. What was the Strategic Rocket Force, now PLA Rocket Force, the PLA Army General Command, and the Strategic Support Force. So those other bastions that you had before have now been broken up into 15 new agencies. Now that has it's obviously designed in many respects to try to streamline, to assist this goal of jointness, but also to break down some aspects of the corruption battle, as well as that stranglehold that the Army has had in terms of the command structure. By any good bureaucracy, a good way to move people around and change that kind of dynamic is to just create different boxes on the depth chart. And that there certainly is an aspect of this going on. You saw the announcement at the PLA parade for the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II about the reduction of 300,000 troops. That, many of you who watch these issues, isn't a surprise because they've been talking for years of further reductions anyway to get to some of the goals that they have. Plus, in a sense, like Nick and I were just talking about before, right after announcing this, the party put out word via the organization department to leading SOEs that they're expected to hire these people. So they're really sort of staying on the books, just going under somebody else's org chart, which in and of itself isn't too surprising either. The same kind of thing happened in the late 90s when Jiang Zemin had the first deal with the PLA of getting out of business and reducing the size. There was just a reshifting of where the people went. Now, all this, what are the neighbors going to have to say? You'd see the competing claims, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with here. That looks like very colorful spaghetti. But you've got a relatively tight area with a lot of claims and increasing degrees of hardware available to go into the area, and depending on how that is used, and depending on things like we're seeing now with the surface-to-air missiles, the radar stations, et cetera, it already is generating a reaction from folks in terms of, okay, what does this mean? What does it mean in terms of intent? What does it mean in terms of what we need to do about it? And talking to each other about it to figure out what is the appropriate level of reaction. The new arms race, I just wanted to throw this in here to show this is certainly from, to a degree, from China's argument here. They felt a little late to the game in terms of the island building and then therefore how the islands could be used from the region, and certainly that has been a factor in their thinking for the last, I'd say the last 8 years or so. But what you see now, despite the supposed promise that Xi Jinping made to President Obama in September in Washington about not militarizing the South China Sea, what they're essentially doing is militarizing the South China Sea, but claiming that it's a reaction to U.S. efforts here rather than an initial step being taken by China. It'll be interesting to see how much that is believed by or bought by folks in the neighborhood. At the end of the day, though, and we can talk about this more in our question period, I think the Chinese leadership has made the calculation several years back, particularly around the time of the Syrian Red Line issue, that the U.S. is distracted in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq, that it will not stand up unless provoked in a way that it has to react in the Asian region, that is, as long as you salami slice your way with issues not worth going to conflict over, that there's a period of opportunity through the rest of the Obama administration to change the facts on the ground. Also with the assumption that whoever comes after Obama is likely to be more, or should I say, less benign towards China. And so that's all feeding into a situation. I've actually had the ambassador in Beijing, who was a classmate at SICE a long time ago, comment on this fairly openly, which he's a very seasoned diplomat, Cui Tiankai, and that just doesn't happen unless you feel pretty comfortable that that's the situation. Feel very comfortable in changing that situation on the ground, and you're seeing it play out right in front of us right now. Obviously, the deployment of surface-to-air missiles, we saw the islands, the land reclamation, the disputed airspace. I think that's where you see some of the challenges going on. Saw it with the Australians recently. You see it when they're watching the freedom of navigation ops going on. That's likely to continue. I think a lot of folks are waiting for the declaration of an ADIZ. And if you really want to think out ahead, is there a Chinese version of the Monroe Doctrine at some point coming down the pike? Obviously unclear at this point, but if you draw a trend line out from what has been happening thus far, you could see a scenario where that kind of incentive would be there on the Chinese side. I'm going to stop there. I look forward to any questions that any of you have. I'd like to have more of a discussion here. And again, I appreciate you all coming today. Thank you.